Shana Tova. You're fasting? Again? What now? The Jewish mother said to her newly religious son as she scrambled some eggs on the morning of Tisha B'Av. By the time I met her son, he was a famous Orthodox rabbi. He had founded the prestigious Bronfman and Wexner Fellowships, served as the rabbi in residence for the UJA Federation of New York, and been named by Newsweek one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America. But he didn't grow up Orthodox, and that morning in 1973, he stood in his mother's kitchen and explained why he wouldn't be eating eggs on the 9th of Av anymore. Ma, I'm sorry, it's just that they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. They what? She exclaimed. Well, we better throw a bake sale. I wonder what the rabbis would have said. Of course, the miscommunication here was that the son was speaking of the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE and 70 CE. But his ma can't be blamed for panicking. After all, it was 1973. Israel's control of Jerusalem was only a 6-year-old phenomenon, and the leaders of Egypt and Syria were inching towards Israel's border. 8.5 weeks later, 50 years ago today, by the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria coordinated an attack on Israel that began what became known as the Yom Kippur War. In this Yom Kippur, we sit at the juxtaposition of 2 anniversaries. 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War began, and 30 years ago, on September 13th, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. The Oslo Accords raised hopes in the Israeli and American Jewish communities that peace might be just around the corner. That hope did not last long. In 1995, 2 years later, Rabin was assassinated. Attempts to implement Oslo devolved into violence. By 1997, a correspondent in our local J Weekly wrote, "Why do American Jews remain silent as the Arab-Israeli peace process falls apart? With every day that passes, another thread snaps in the fabric that Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres wove so carefully, and the hopes that most Israelis share to resolve the Palestinians' problem and achieve real peace with their neighbors fades." I've read similar words recently. On July 31st of this summer, Rachel and David Bialy, who helped establish New Lehr House, wrote in the J, "Last Tuesday, a rally was held in front of the Israeli consulate in downtown San Francisco so we could add our voices to those on the streets of Israel. There were maybe 200 people there, mostly Israelis and Old Bay Area lefties, organized by the Israeli expat protest group Unacceptable. Where was the Jewish community? The Federation, the Jewish Community Relations Council, the rabbis, and their congregants. Unacceptable organizes protests across the United States in solidarity with the protests in Israel, which began in January as an effort to stop Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition from passing a package of government reform laws. However, over time, the tenor of the Israeli protest movement has shifted. Yossi Klein Halevi, one of Israel's leading centrist thinkers, explains, "What has changed for me over the past year is the realization that the time of our illusions is over. The reason this year has been so traumatic is because we're being forced to face very deep structural problems within Israeli society. Whether the state within a state that the ultra-Orthodox have created, or settler violence that is no longer a fringe phenomenon, as I mistakenly said over the years, or more deeply, whether it's facing the consequences of 2,000 years of Jewish exile on the Jewish psyche, on the Jewish soul. We're looking at unresolved layers of rage within parts of the Jewish people, which is expressed in pathological ways in Israeli society today," he continues. "We're looking at the theological consequences of exile, which are unresolved, and how this compensatory theology of Jewish triumphalism, an exaggerated sense of Jewish chosenness, which sustained us in exile through centuries of humiliation, which was the compensation of the Jewish people, but today under conditions of power is becoming lethal, most of all to Judaism itself. There's another historical flashpoint that makes me nervous. It's not an anniversary, but rather a pattern pointed out by Israeli polymath Micha Goodman and Rabbi Angelo Buchtal. There have been two other times in Jewish history when Jews have had sovereignty over themselves. The first was the kingdom established by King David 3,000 years ago, which lasted 8 decades until infighting divided the north from the south and the United Kingdom fell. The second was the Hasmonean kingdom during the Second Temple era. Israeli journalist Menachem Rahat writes, "It existed for 77 years as a united and sovereign kingdom. In the 8th decade of its life, the kingdom was torn apart by infighting, which led the representatives of the two camps claiming the crown to approach Pompey in Syria, each one begging him to agree to make them vassals of Rome." This year, we celebrated Israel's 75th Yom HaAtzmaut, anniversary of independence. Israel is in its 8th decade. In the middle of this 8th decade, we are facing the deepest societal division Israel has ever experienced. In a seminar with Shalom Hartman Institute this week, scholar Levi Morrow described a conversation with one of his students in which they debated whether Israel's cold civil war has begun or is about to begin, and when the cold civil war might transition into a hot, meaning violent, civil war. Have you heard the talk of a new two-state solution? Not where the land is divided between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, but rather between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I've been worried about Israel's future for years, but this year has added a new layer to my concern. I hope that the rhetoric is overblown. I hope that the reawakening of the left leads to a new direction with the Palestinians. I hope to find out this and more when I travel with the Northern California Board of Rabbis in a few months. I hope that going will help close the gap between our community and our Israeli brethren. Some of us at Am Tikva feel very close to Israel. Some feel connected but not sure how or why to engage in this historical moment. And some have deep misgivings about this relationship. Sometimes the distance between American Jews and the Jewish state is greater than the miles. Many of our points of reference are different than those of our Israeli cousins. In secular, integrated American Jewry, our Jewishness is not always the most obvious thing about us, nor do we always put it at the forefront. But in Israel, Jewishness is a defining feature at every line and level, from the tension and conflict with Palestinians to the secular religious divisions. One's type of Jewish practice is inseparable from one's dress, social life, and often politics. The miracle of 1948 might have been the reestablishment of the Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years, but the miracle of today is that Israel can be so divided and still function. The intra-religious relationships of Israel are small daily miracles. Identity politics are a defining feature of the state. For decades, the international Zionist community has been proud that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. This pairing of democracy and identity would not function in an American paradigm. A Christian and democratic federal government? That has very different connotations here. The dissonance of these frameworks is captured in a famous interaction between Golda Meir and Henry Kissinger. Kissinger says to Golda, "You must remember that first I am an American, second I am Secretary of State, and third I am a Jew." Golda replies, "Henry, you forget that in Israel we read from right to left." As American Jews, our historical relationship with Israel has been both close and distanced. On the one hand, we share a history and tradition that centers the land of Israel as both a token of and fertile ground for our relationship with God. Our prayers, Tanakh, and rabbinic literature center the land of Israel in our theology and praxis. In turn, Jewish references infuse the literature, pop culture, political slogans, even advertising in Israel. We share our Jewish connection to the land and tradition. On the other hand, we don't vote or serve in the Israeli army, so most of us do not share the trauma and complication that accompanies Israeli life. Consequently, Israelis have often pushed back at American engagement in their internal affairs, and American Jews sometimes feel more foreign there than they expect. Furthermore, as Israel's Jewish populace and polity becomes more Haredi, the difference between the dominant values of Israelis and Americans grows. In her viral Rosh Hashanah sermon, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl said, "Most American Jews see our Judaism as inextricably linked with our ethical values of democracy, egalitarianism, pluralism. American Jews know discrimination and bigotry, and as little than 2% of America's population, we're particularly sensitive to minority rights. When we hear Israel's government write off Reform and conservative Jews as inauthentic, when ministers declare that a Palestinian village deserves to be wiped out, or proudly affirm their homophobia in the name of Judaism, we recall the core charge we were raised with at our Seder tables, to be attuned to the outsider, because we are that outsider." We should note that there's a distinction between Israel's land, government, and people. But how can we be a stranger in our homeland? I believe that this feeling of distance comes from the shortcomings of how we think about our relationship with Israel. Our discourse lacks rhetorical tools to capture the complexity of this relationship, and thus the conversation gets cheapened into binary dichotomies. Either you're for or against, either you're engaged or you're not. What framework can we apply that can hold the conflicting truths of feeling pride and dismay? What metaphor can help us communicate that we love Israel but feel powerless, or we feel distanced and disenchanted but have not forgotten our communal connection? For most of my year in Jerusalem, I searched for answers. I felt all of these things in turn. I felt proud and committed to progressive, egalitarian Israeli Judaism when I joined Women of the Wall on Rosh Chodesh Elul, only to have my throat hooked by a cloth banner pulled by a Haredi teenage girl who wanted to silence my voice. I was sometimes greeted with suspicion when Jews discovered that I'd learned Arabic and lived in Jordan, even though I pursued such learning to better understand all of Israel's residents and ideally partners in the pursuit of peace. I hiked from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, and wandered all quarters of the old city of Jerusalem, feeling a visceral connection to the land. I felt seen in the Jewishness of the cycle of the year. Pride and dismay, misunderstanding, connection and acceptance, inspiration, love and pain. I realized through this roller coaster that the metaphor I needed was family. There are those I love and always feel close to. There are those I love and with whom my relationship is strained. There are those who I don't see often and those who I see all the time. Sometimes we understand each other and sometimes we don't. Sometimes people are cut off because they've caused such an intolerable offense. But even when that happens, the familial relationship will never be erased. It is a relationship that weathers both the easy years and the hard. Why does it matter to reconsider how we frame our relationship to Israel? Because it changes the role we play in this moment. Just as the Israeli left has risen from the ashes, so too must the liberal Zionist community in America. 3 Israeli luminaries, Yossi Klein Halevi, Daniel Hartman, and Mati Friedman, addressed us, the American Jewish community, in an open letter in the Times of Israel. They wrote, "The changes afoot will have dire consequences for the solidarity of Israel society, and it will do grave damage to our relations with you. This is a moment for alarm." we are being called on to respond to the moment. In the Purim story, Esther hesitates to respond to her people's moment of crisis. She tells Mordecai that she cannot approach the king for fear of her life. Mordecai responds, "Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you've attained a royal position for just such a crisis." As we live in the United States, this king's palace of progressive Judaism, let us not keep silent. For if we do, some other camp will step into the void to become the leaders of our people. Whether we are fasting by physical or symbolic deprivation, let us fast as Esther ultimately did to prepare for the important work ahead. Let us fast as the young rabbi-to-be fasted to mourn the days when Jews turned against each other and Jerusalem was destroyed. Let us write and seal in our lives the words of Danielle Hartman, "I want next year to be a year where we continue to show up." And it'll both require us to show up, and it will require the formation of a language which inspires. That's the critical shift that I feel we need to have next year for the country. May our fast be meaningful today. Gemar Chatima Tova.